Okay, so today we're going to be learning about continuity and change. You're going to learn about what continuity and change are, how they occur, and sometimes when they're resisted. We're also going to learn about a couple of theories on how the process, a couple of theories on the process of change. So we're going to focus on first on continuity, and this is a really important point to remember, and that is continuity does not mean the absence of change. So continuity does not happen by itself, and that's because change is always occurring, change is always happening. So we're going to, as we look at continuity and change, well, specifically continuity, you're always going to be looking at it in conjunction with change, trying to figure out what aspects and features are continuing in the face of change. And that's another really important to remember, is that whilst change is occurring, there is always things that are remaining the same. So we're going to focus on an example, which is feminism, and because feminism is a really good example of what continuity and change is, and how continuity can kind of coexist with change. You've got the feminist movement, and this is, the woman with the changes that are occurring for her. And, you've got clear changes in terms of the workplace, and you've got clear changes in terms of her rights, and you've got clear changes in terms of her status in Australian society and culture. However, with all of this, you've still got the continuation of domestic roles. So women continue to do more domestic work than their men, even in conjunction with being in the workplace. Another clear example of continuity is pay. So that's not a Y, that's a W. So even though the changes to women's kind of rights in the workplace have been implemented for 40 years, women still don't earn equal pay, so they're about 80% of male pay. And so even though laws have been implemented to kind of stop that, we still have this continuation of women being paid less. And then obviously you've got the continuation of men being in power. And that's kind of linked to that idea of status, that women don't have the status of being in charge. And, that's reflected with the fact that only about 10% of CEOs are women. We've only had one female Prime Minister in our entire historical lifetime of Australia. So this is all great examples of continuity in the face of change. Even though we've got mass change in terms of the ways women's lives operate, we've still got clear aspects that are continuing and don't seem to be going away anytime soon. Okay, so why does continuity occur even in the face of change? Why do these features and aspects continue to happen even when change is occurring? And one of the main reasons is conformity. So the habit of the individual to conform to what we know, to continue features and aspects that make sense to us, that we're comfortable with. So even when big things are changing, we might still maintain our habits or our points of views or the way we see the world, even in the face of change. So there's 4 reasons why this occurs. So that's fear of loss of power, strongly held beliefs, psychological barriers, and ethnocentrism. And this is kind of when conformity is at its strongest, when any one of these 4 features is in existence. So the first one is fear of loss of power. And what this means is that when the individuals or groups in power feel the change is going to undermine that power. I might change colours so that we can see this a little bit more clearly. So great example of this. So this is a great example of change that we're going to look at more in depth, and that's in Afghanistan. When we start to look at Afghanistan, that fear of loss of power will really make sense, because that's kind of the reason why a lot of change is being resisted, or just lots of continuity is occurring in Afghanistan. So another example of when conformity is at its strongest is when there's strongly held beliefs. And, examples of this is like Muslims' rejection of Westernization. So Muslims strongly believe in kind of their ways of life and their values, and this is kind of informed by their beliefs in Islam and kind of the doctrine around that. And they just see Westernization as inconducive with a lot of those beliefs and values. So there's a clear rejection of that. Another really good Australian example of this is the rejection of gay marriage within Christian groups, so Christian lobbyists and conservative Christian groups. And this is, because they feel that change does not kind of coexist with their beliefs. And so, therefore, they want to continue with what's occurring now, and that is marriage between a man and a woman, and not men or women. Okay, so the next one is psychological barriers, and what this is that the change is not understood. So when we don't understand the change, we don't want the change. So yeah, psychological barriers is essentially when change is not understood. So when we can't make sense of the change, or there's just not enough information out there on the change. A really good example of this is the 1999 referendum in Australia, because we were in 1999 we were trying to push for independence or a republic in Australia, and not most, but it failed because we didn't really understand what we would become when we became a republic. We didn't know what our government would be. There was it was more about should we leave or shouldn't we, and then there was no real discussion on what would become after. And so people didn't really understand the change, and therefore it was kind of voted against. It was one of the reasons, but a big reason that's kind of been brought up is it lost because people didn't know what was going to happen. And then obviously the last one is ethnocentrism. And ethnocentrism we have looked at a little bit through like intercultural communication, so you might remember it, but if not, I'll just quickly remind you, it's the belief that a culture is better than others. And what that means is when change is seen to come outside of a culture and people are judging it based on their own values and beliefs, people can kind of reject it or not want it, or they might just want to continue in what they're doing because they believe that the culture is doing well, so therefore no need for change. Again, another example of this is like halal certification. And, halal certification has kind of existed in Australia for a long time, but now it's becoming more prevalent and more obvious because of the kind of attitudes around Muslims in Australia. And so it's seen that, there are aspects in Australian culture that don't agree with halal certification, so the supporting of Islam in Australia, and therefore they're kind of trying to maintain the lack of Islam in Australian kind of culture and societies, and therefore it's being rejected. Okay, so another reason why continuity occurs in the face of change is because of cultural lag. So cultural lag is kind of understood as what happens when changes are implemented or exist or have occurred, but not all of it or a lot of it can't be recognised. And this is mostly referring to changes that have occurred on like an institutional level, but then, in terms of the way we think and understand the world, that hasn't changed. So, there is, again, going to maybe come back to feminism. Clear examples of that is the changes to Parliament. So women were allowed to be elected into Parliament from the 1920s, but we still only currently have about 1/3 of our Parliament representatives being women. And, it took us until the 2010s to get a female Prime Minister. And so those are all examples. Minister. Yeah, those are all examples of, cultural lag, the fact that changes have been implemented and it's taken a long time for those changes to kind of take shape in our minds and understanding. Another clear example of that is racism in America. So slavery was abolished in the 1800s, and still we have views of how African Americans are seen to be inferior compared to white Americans. And that's, after almost, yeah, because it was about 1880s, 1860s that slavery was abolished, but it's still 120, 30 years after that, and there's still these attitudes of inferiority that's tied to cultural lag, and that's kind of a reason why continuity is occurring, or an explanation of that continuity because of cultural lag. Okay, so now we're going to look at change, and remember, change is always in conjunction with continuity. So change obviously can be at a small level, it can be on a large level, and it's really important to note that, change always happens. So change can be something as small as our changes to our daily lives. So in 2 years' time, your lives are going to change as individuals quite significantly because you'll no longer be in high school. Your roles in your family change all the time. So from what your roles were as a young baby and a young child to what they are now as a teenager, to what they're going to become in the next few years as you become more independent and move out, and then what they'll become when you start your new family and start raising your own kids. Your roles change as you go through life. And then obviously change can be much more bigger, and that can be like the institutional changes, cultural changes that are occurring all the time as well. So the way we understand change is through these 5 headings. It's really important to try and kind of take note of these to really kind of be able to understand and identify the change. So obviously the first part is identifying the change. So is the change in how we think, or is the change in how we do things? So is it changing how we see the world, or how we think the world should operate? Or is it changing our everyday lives? Is it changing the way we operate in society? So it's, and this is important to note, if it's in how we think, it's more cultural, and if it's how we do things, it's usually more social. So the next one is levels of change, and obviously this refers to micro, meso, and macro. And it's really important to note that this is more about where it starts, and that's because, once it starts and it becomes really big, the change will happen on all 3 levels. So it's more about where is that change occurring, and what level is it occurring mostly for. And I say that because like changes to women in the workplace obviously affected them on the micro level, because they started to have to change their role within the family, so they're not just the main caregiver anymore, they're now kind of sharing that load a little bit. And then obviously it changed in the macro world as well, because women then they had to implement laws and rules for women to be able to work in the workplace in a kind of more fairer kind of way, and therefore the changes were occurring on all 3 levels. But obviously the biggest part or aspect has been on the meso. So when we talk about levels, it's where is it starting, where is it biggest for, not where is it happening in the absence of others. So then the next one is the rate of change, and rate of change is mainly just 2 aspects. So is it gradual or rapid, and is it sporadic or spasmodic, is a really good word I like to use, or is it organised? So, and gradual and rapid, kind of fairly self-explanatory. Gradual means that the change is happening slowly over time. Rapid means that it's quite quick change and it occurs, within a few weeks or within a few days. Spasmodic or sporadic. I didn't spell that right. I might just rub that out so we can see how to spell that properly. So spasmodic change is referring to not kind of clearly organised. So organised change, or organic change, or orderly change, that's referring to when the change is planned. So like the upcoming potential vote on gay rights, marriage, that it would be orderly or organised or orderly or organised change, because we know that it's coming and we've been talking about it and we've been planning for it. Spasmodic is when there's no clear, maybe no clear reason for the change. There may be no organisation for the change, and the change might be occurring in a range of different places by a range of different groups of people. So the change might not be very clear. So that's the rate of change. Then direction of change, there's 3 directions of change. The first one is linear, and we're going to look more into this as we look into evolutionary theories of change, and that's when it's progressive and not repetitive. And then there is cyclical change, and that's when the change kind of occurs kind of over time in a cycle, and so something might change and then it might go back to what it was before, and then it might change again and then it might go back to what it was before. So this is definitely seen as repetitive change, and this change is kind of used to explain like the rise and fall of civilizations. And then the last direction of change is dialectical. And that's like a combination of both cyclical and linear. Dialectical is small cyclical change with large linear change. It just sees it as a combination of both. The last one is magnitude of change, and that's just really how big is it. So is it affecting, everyone? Is it affecting just a small group of people? Has the change been so big that it's completely changed the way we function in society? Or is the change just a small change for, a small group of people, like the changes to the one-punch laws? That would be a small change because it's only really impacting on those that are doing the king hit punches and those that are being punched. Whereas the lockout law changes, that would be much greater because it's kind of changing behaviours and attitudes of individuals in Sydney. What's the magnitude of change? Okay, so there's a few reasons why change occurs or happens. So the first one is discovery of something that already exists. So an example of this would be like Muslims in Australia. They've been here since pretty much the convicts came here, but they was never really a recognised group of society. Like, they existed, but nobody really cared about them until 9/11, and since then, changes have occurred significantly because of that recognition. So a discovery of something that already exists happens all the time and can cause change, especially when we're not happy or we want to fix something that's already happening. And then an invention of something new. A really good example of this is the motor car. So, the introduction of the car in the 1950s saw mass change for, Australia, America. The creation of mass shopping centres, the urban sprawl that occurred, so people moving out of the cities and moving into more urban, suburban areas, that all came because of the car. So the car has changed life for humans significantly, and then obviously travelling and all that kind of stuff has become more available and more easy with the car. And then another reason why change occurs is 9/11. A catalyst event, so not like 9/11. Obviously 9/11 has changed society and our global world completely. The idea of Islamic terrorism didn't exist before 9/11. The understanding or kind of fear around migration and immigration kind of existed, but not to the same extent that it does now. And obviously lives of Muslims have changed significantly since then. New laws, new cultural ways of seeing the world have all changed from 9/11. And then the other kind of cause or reason for change is innovation. So again, you've got technological, like I said, the motor car, or phones, internet. Those are all kind of technological changes which shape the way we behave and see the world. Then there's cultural changes, and that's just the introduction of new ideas, beliefs, or behaviours or values. And that's, can come from a range or reason of things. A good example of this is American culture being kind of shared through media. Another really good example of this is gay marriage. So Australia didn't, if you're in the 1990s, you wouldn't be as supportive of gay marriage as you are now, and that's just because it just wasn't the thing. It wasn't an understood belief or value at that time. 40 years ago, gay marriage, and not even marriage, just homosexuality was illegal, and you could be arrested and you could go to psychiatric treatments because you were homosexual. So it's only a very new, recent acceptance, and so it's definitely causing change as well. It's causing changes in the way we behave and treat other people. It's also potentially going to be causing change in a macro societal level with changes to marriage laws. And then obviously the social changes, social innovations can occur. And that's, a really good example of this is the transnational corporations, or TNCs, which have, significantly changed employment, tax, and ideas and concept of national and global. They've also, you could kind of tie McDonald's and KFC and Pizza Hut and all these kinds of companies to obesity and obesity levels in Australia. So they can even cause changes in the way we behave and our attitudes. Okay, so last part of this lesson is going to be looking at two theories on the process of change. So there's two theories, like I said, which is evolutionary and transformative. So evolutionary kind of ties back to, and this is looking at what we were looking at before in terms of the direction, magnitude, and things like that. Evolutionary change, and these are the important points you want to remember for evolutionary change, and that is that change is gradual. So they don't see change to be rapid, they see it to be gradual over time. It's continuous, so change is always occurring. It's non-reversible, so unlike transformative change, it doesn't seem to be like it can be cyclical. It's only ever linear change. There are always elements of continuity within the change, and that's because the change is so gradual that continuity occurs with it. And it's sequential, and what that means is that it goes from small to big to bigger change. So I've got some drawings for you, and this is just the first. Evolutionary theory has been around for a while, and this is kind of the first thinkings of it. So early evolutionary theorists believed that change was going from the small to the medium to the complex of societies, and they believed that there was only one way that change could occur and where it could come from, and they kind of tied evolutionary change with modernization and westernization. And so, they believed that societies all started from that hunter and gatherer kind of societies, which are fairly basic. There's, a lack of institutions and a lack of organizations, and it's just people hunting and gathering food. And then that moved to a more industrialized society where greater kind of institutions were created and the world became a little bit more complex, to what we have now, which is a modern globalized Western society. So we've moved away from the national and have become global in our ways of running and operating our society. So becoming inherently more complex. And it's really important to note that time is always the kind of constant with these changes. Modern evolutionary theory has changed somewhat, so it still sees change to be non-reversible and somewhat linear, so going from more basic to more complex. However, they believe what those changes can mean are different now. So it doesn't mean that it's going to be modern or Western. All it takes is that it's going to be more complex. So the creation of newer ways of organising each other and different groups and institutions and networking groups, networks that kind of operate as we go through time. So we start again from the more basic to the medium to the more complex. But as you can see in this drawing, the change is occurring from, the change is coming from various places. So it's not just from Western modern societies, it's now from various other locations. Okay, so the last kind of theory on process of change that we're going to look at for now, there will be other theories that we look at later on, is transformative change. So transformative change is quite different to evolutionary change theory, and that's because, firstly it sees change to be rapid. So unlike evolutionary theory, it doesn't really see change to be as a gradual level. It sees change to occur fairly quickly and fairly rapidly. And because they see change to be so rapid, it occurs on all levels. So it's so big and it's so rapid that it occurs on the micro, meso, and macro levels kind of concurrently at the same time. Whereas evolutionary theory could see that change that comes from, one level or two levels and therefore trickles down and affects all. They also see change being triggered by a push for change, and what this means is there are catalysts or there are agents for change. They recognise these agents of change being either technology, strong social movements, rebellions, or revolutions. Because, again, the change is so big, it's seen to be permanent. And they usually believe that the change is kind of stemmed from inequality. So groups who are pushing for greater power or equality within their society or culture will bring about change, rapid, big change, because other means and forms of bringing small change have been ineffective. So, like, they will push for a revolution because petitioning and emailing and contacting and protesting have just not worked. So then they'll push for revolution. Transformative change, really great example of transformative change is protests and revolutions. And, we've seen a couple of examples of this in the terms of the Arab Springs. So you've got groups of people who are kind of not happy with their way of life and how they're operating. And so they protest and kind of call for a revolution against the government. This obviously changes the way societies run once they are successful, and that's because they bring about changes to the major institution that runs the country, but they also cause changes to day-to-day lives through the changes to the government. New laws, new regulations change our day-to-day lives. So transformative change, that process of change, only really refers to big and rapid change, whereas evolutionary change refers to gradual and can lead to transformative change, but it needs to be gradual, so it can't be rapid. So that's today's lesson, looking at continuity and change. It's really important that you do take your study notes now as we go along. So record down, what change and continuity is, how they occur or are resisted. Make sure you include examples so you can refer to them throughout the term, and then also include just the main points or outlines of transformative change.